All right, well, thanks everyone for joining us. In the next hour or so, we'll be talking about some underground newspapers and such. I think this might be the best angle, so I'm going to stay here. What we're going to talk about today is the particular newspapers that were published unconventionally, I'd say, or maybe community-centered or DIY, if you want to think about it in those terms, and that were published in the 60s and 70s. I'm co-presenting today with an English faculty and journalism instructor, Tony Countryman, who is in the Zoom as well. And she'll be talking about the sort of communication piece and things of on that side in terms of writing and what you would, different types of writing that you might find in those newspapers. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm gonna have to look here a couple of times behind me. So on the agenda today were the introduction I just gave. My name is Roger Morales, and I am the reference and instruction librarian here at MCC. We'll talk about briefly here the American in the 60s and 70s and the birth of the underground press. I'll talk briefly about archives and what that means in terms of where you get information, and I'll show you some examples here on the slides that I have. There is a social change map that we'll talk about, and those actually have all the locations, areas in which the newspapers were printed, and those communities and what that means for them. And as the title implies, the social change, so it's trying to track any change that might have come or influenced by those newspapers. We'll talk about writing styles and content, and that'll be Tony. And then we'll talk about also that is community-centered. Sorry about that noise. In terms of finance, advertising, and membership. So if you want to click on to the next slide there, Tony. So before we click on this video, so the general introduction is that during the 60s and 70s, there was a birth boom, right? Which is why they're called the baby boomers. There were about 90 million something, people that were in their 20s around this time. And so as you can expect, the topics that were being discussed and things that were interest were slightly different around that time. During the 60s and 70s, we got an uprise in terms of different types of publication and where information came from. They were trying to express or get the truth out without sort of all of the obstacles that traditional newspapers or that process might hinder. So to set up this video here, this is a quick interview. The video is a little bit fuzzy, so please be patient there, but the audio is good. He used to work on underground newspapers and is sort of introducing why they came to be and how they came to be. And in particular, he was an editor, I believe for the Chicago Seed, although I'm not 100% now as I say that. I think Tony, you can go ahead and hit the video, the intro video, and we'll talk here on the other side.
When you want to find out what progressives are thinking on issues of the day, you don't read the corporate newspapers like New York Times or Washington Post. With today's technology, you can go to independent blog sites like Daily Kos and Huffington Post. These sites, so vital to the health of our democratic society, didn't appear out of nowhere. Most bloggers don't know it. They may never have heard of them, but their roots are in the underground papers that sprang forth and blossomed during the Vietnam era, thanks to what was then the new technology of offset printing. They were united, every one of them, against the Vietnam War, but they also spoke to their own unique audiences, including the liberation movements that planted their seeds during that period and are now part of the mainstream. They represented the gay, lesbian, feminist, Black, Puerto Rican, Native American, socialist, Southern consciousness, psychedelic, prisoners' rights, military, New Age, rank and file, and other independent voices of what was known in the 60s and 70s as the counterculture. Beginning in December 2010, Michigan State University Press would publish the 4-volume Voices from the Underground series of stories on these amazing papers, starting with insider histories of the Vietnam-era underground press. 2 anthologies and 2 monographs. Read insider histories written by key players on each of the papers in their own unique voices. Vietnam War ended because of the relentless force of the anti-war movement, led by the patriots of the underground press. The government spied on them, infiltrated their organizations, and attacked their leaders. But these heroes persisted and brought our soldiers home. Insider Histories of the Vietnam-era Underground Press, coming soon from Michigan State University Press. Reserve your order now for the...
I think it's still going there, Tony.
What progressives are thinking on issues.
Sorry.
All right, thanks. This was the best video that I could find to sort of summarize the entire thing there. He does give his own opinions and such there, but what he was pointing at was that most of the newspapers were counterculture or were described as such, and they were united on a lot of the social issues, including the Vietnam War and other things of that nature. So here we have about 5 different ones. We're going to particularly focus in on the seed, on the first one there from Chicago. We'll talk about Palante, which is the one here. It's a Puerto Rican newspaper, the third one. And then we'll also talk about the Black Panther in general. Those are the 3 that we're going to focus in today. But we will have examples from these other 2, which is the Berkeley Bar and the Fifth Estate from Detroit. If you want to go ahead and click on through there, Tony. Okay, so just generally speaking, in the 60s and 70s, these newspapers sort of acted as the voice for the marginalized, right? So this independent publishing in general was a big issue here. So because they were able to publish and make their own sort of newspapers and publications, we had this sort of flurry of these publications. So before the Vietnam era, the term underground newspaper was used to describe publications of resistance groups and totalitarian societies, such as Moscow-based underground poetry journal, Syntaxis, I hope I said that right, starting in the 1960s with young journalists repurposing the underground label to describe their radical and countercultural publications. And then we also have Newsbeat at the time, was dominated by 3 television networks, which I believe was NBC, ABC, and CBS possibly. And so they wanted some sort of alternative, right? So the 2 wire services that fed uniform package of national and international news to urban daily newspapers. So they saw the sort of same thing being covered, other stories that they thought were valuable or that were not being covered in mainstream media, and they wanted to bring that to their communities and make it free and accessible. All right, so these are some of the ones that are represented. Since we are doing this on Black History Month, we are focusing in on those. So we have African Americans, we have laborers and workers, such as labor laws and things like that. The entire Latinx community, the LGBTQ plus community, civil rights groups, feminist organization, environmental activists, anti-war GIs, and American mobilized in new ways to promote social change. So I think at the heart of all of this, what they really wanted to present was social change, or at the very least, influence the American society in that fashion. All right, Tony, I think we can hit on next one. Okay, so the business model. So one of the things I always found really interesting is that most of these newspapers were free. If not, they were very close to free. They were very cheap. And the reason why is that they wanted it to be more accessible, and they wanted it to be in the hands of those folks that actually need it. So with that being said, they didn't want to exclude anyone because they couldn't either buy it or didn't have access to it. So therefore, they tried to make it as free as possible. There were some subscription stuff, but for the most part, it was free. Most undergrounds initially relied on street sales, right? So there was that person on the street corner, or it was in those boxes that you find in the city, put in a quarter, and then you get those out of there. So they typically charge 10 cents a copy, with the proceeds split between the seller and the newspaper, and the larger newspaper dependent on crews of loyal street sellers. But in other words, case writers, artists, and the whole staff pitched in to get it all done. The art in particular, just as a side note, is phenomenal in these, and you'll see in the covers. So here I got free distribution became more and more common in the 70s, and eventually most papers switched to free distribution in news boxes and increasingly relied on ad revenue. By 1972, 73, these newspapers usually pivoted from using the label underground to alternative press. and which you might still see some of those actually around. So basically, they were community centered through and through, and they wanted it to be free and as accessible as possible. All right, so the first example that we have here is the Berkeley Bar, and it's from California. As you can see here, we have a cop, and there's a person that looks like with like a half head or something like that. And then we have on the right side, we actually have the cover. Most of the covers or most of the artwork is along this line here, and we'll see a couple of different ones, but generally they do not depict police officers or any sort of person of authority in a positive light. Typically that is the case. If you can accept that one person there, thank you. So here we have the other one here. This is a Puerto Rican publication from the Bronx. The Young Lords Party actually was a political party. There were some chapters here in the Chicagoland area as well. Adelante in general was, as you can see here on the left-hand side, it says liberation or death. And then on the right side, I put one that sort of speaks to the civil unrest here in the city or in the city in general. And that is police attack Puerto Ricans in a parade, I think it's what it says. The Young Lords Party was very similar to the Black Panther Party or even or any sort of equivalent there. They were politically active and were looking for the liberation of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico in general is a territorial land of the United States. They do not have voting rights, and therefore it still is a very big topic. So Puerto Ricans, as it stands right now, cannot vote in any presidential election or anything of the matter. So a lot of the things that they discussed here was how to get that liberation or how to become a full citizen within the United States. For whatever it's worth, there was a Puerto Rican party that had an assassination attempt on a US president. It was obviously failed, but because of that, these sorts of newspapers and publications became targeted, and we'll see that here in the Black Panther. So you can click on over. The one here, Chicago Seed, this happens to be my favorite and how I sort of stumbled across this topic in general. The Chicago Seed had some of the best, in my opinion, are sort of artistic rendering from this time period, given this genre and everything else. These are actual covers. These are screen prints. Most of these are in the large format, so they're like those ones that you would find way back in the day that you would fold. I don't know exact sizes, but they were like the size of your torso, kind of. The colors here are, as you can tell, very fascinating. They have a lot of interesting topics that they cover in general. There's a line of demarcation within this publication. So before the Democratic Convention of, I think, 67 or 69, what year was that, Tony? The one that happened with Daley. It was somewhere mid 60s.
It was actually in 68.
68. Oh, I was right in between. So if you don't know the history of that, I would urge you to go ahead and find that. It's a big part of our country's history, but also very pertinent to the Chicagoland area. So generally, before that demonstration and that protest, the Chicago Seed was a counterculture newspaper, but it was more sort of in the arts and I should say more in the social life circle, if you will. So they were more interested in other things rather than straight politics. But once that sort of happened, that sort of changed the way that the newspaper felt and read. So you go ahead and click on the next one there, Tony. So focusing in here on some of the women's issues and some of the other ones that we wanted to focus in here. This particular one, we have Popeye and olive oil here, and it says Seed, Free City, Free Sisters. As you can see there on the bottom, I think it had a year. Doesn't. But this comes from the archive. This was our first women's issue, says Peck, who was the main editor from the time. Power to the Sisters. Several of the staffers worked for Jane and an underground affiliate referral service. So you saw women's sensibilities fully integrated into the Seed in the 1970s when the women's movement was kind of crescendoing. So they wanted to represent what was happening in the time, and they wanted to have accurate representation for women as well. So a lot of the newspapers had feminist beginnings, if you will. or if not, we're straight up, feminist. So here on a totally different, topic, they were talking about the pusher man. So the pusher man is the drug dealer. So in the city, particularly South Side, you can find a lot of drugs and things of that nature. So they didn't want to shy away from topics that might, make them as well, right? Because they, for the most part, I think they were admitted, drug users. So here they were talking about how, drugs in general was sort of, plaguing their community, and how in particular drug dealers were kind of an issue. As you can read here on the cover, this was actually one of the first covers that they didn't have an artistic rendering. This is an actual stage picture. And this was one of the first and few in this publication that they had. Most of them were artistic renderings by commissioned artists. Hit the next one there. So this is the issue here, line of demarcation. Right after this, this was the issue right after, in 68, you're right, Tony. This is the issue right after the convention. If you're unfamiliar with Chicago history in general, the top right, the face that you can see that says 35 cents, that is Mayor Daley. And then on the side profile of the pig is his face as well. The pig is in a darker skin pigmentation to match Mayor Daley. And as you can see, it is not typically is not seen as a positive artistic rendition. Mayor Daley kind of came down with the police and sort of herded the crowd, and there was some police brutality and things of that nature from that demonstration. It was a Democratic convention, and they had a lot of citizens and members and readers of these newspapers were against what Daley and the Democratic convention was, going for. So they had a demonstration, and then there were some unfortunate things that happened after. So this is the cover that sort of represents that hostility towards Chicago residents and the police. Okay, so this is kind of a transition here. The Chicago Seed editors in general, and maybe the people that were involved, seemingly were very copacetic or friendly with the Black Panther, in particular with Fred Hampton. If you're unfamiliar with Fred Hampton's story, he was the leader of the Chicago chapter. Fred Hampton was assassinated by the FBI and was taken down basically because of the acts and things that the Black Panther was doing in that community. Here we have the Chicago Seed memorial for Huey there, which is one of the founders, and which is, I think, the one to the left. And the Chicago Seed in general was pro-Black Panther. So yeah, as we see there in the crowd, the murder of in the quote, the murder of Fred Hampton was a very dramatic event that had can't see, but it has a large influence. The Black Panther Party was very well thought of in Chicago, and Fred Hampton in particular, a lot of us knew. And so there at the end, says the Chicago police were becoming vicious. So they were being targeted, and as a result of either the publication or their activities or both, these individuals were targeted. You get next there, Tony. Okay, so the Black Panther, this is the one that I really wanted to highlight. The Black Panther organization in general is a community organization for the self-defense of Black people in general. It was founded in Oakland, California. They did have revolutionary sort of thoughts or ideas, in the sense that they wanted equality for all Black people, no matter what. As you can see there on the screen, there's an attack on, I think one of us is an attack on all of us, or something to that degree. And so that sort of speaks to what they stood for. One of the things that I didn't include here, because it's a super long kind of paragraph, is that they did have a demonstration in which in California, where the Black Panthers did march up to the state capitol in protest of a gun restriction policy that was to be enacted. That was a large moment in history as well, and it was a big demonstration by the Black Panther in general. All right, Tony, I think you can hit the next one there. So this is one of the founders here. We have Huey on the left-hand side. It's an actual picture with some purple in the back. And then on the right-hand side is the artist that is featured in a lot of these publications. Goes by Emery, has this kind of stencil kind of look to it. Most of the renditions have this sort of style, and most of them are portrayed in this fashion, whether it be sort of in a vulnerable state, one way or the other. All right, hit next there, Tony. And then this is some more pictures here from Fred Hampton. The one on the left is the actual one. I believe that's the memorial one after he was assassinated. And then on the right side, we have one as well from the Chicago Seed. The Seed had a couple of crossover, if you will, where they talked about the Black Panthers, and this happens to be one of them. There's not many. I think there's about 2 or 3 issues of that. But as you can see, they were fond of Fred Hampton, who died, I believe, at 21 or 22 after the invasion of his apartment on the Chicago South Side. All right, you want to hit next there, Tony? Okay, so this is the map that I was telling you about. Let me just check that out. So this is the map that I was telling you about. It might be a little bit difficult to see, but if you click, but if you were to just Google the American social movements and the University of Washington study, you'll be able to click on through there. But if you see on the right side, on the East Coast, we have a whole lot of them. And there's a key there on the side. So each color has its corresponding either issue or community. This is not particularly an archive per se, although it is a part of one. So what they've done here is that by mapping it all together, if you're interested in one, then you'll be able to click on it and then do some further research on that. So go ahead and click on the next one there, Tony. So here we have the ones that are outside on the top of North America, and then I'm sorry, the one on the top is the domestic one, and the one on the bottom is the one that's outside of the States. So you'll see there's a whole lot more in the States, but that doesn't mean this kind of shows that this is still a trend or a pattern outside of the States as well, as you can see there on the bottom. Must have been like about 100 or so outside of the US. All right, so you get hit next there, Tony. And then here we have the publication by year. So we have categories on the top, and then we have just a total number in general. And it seems like 1970 was our peak right over here in the middle. And then it kind of wanes down a little bit towards the end of the 70s. But generally speaking, the ones that it's around that time period, around like 1969, with a famous summer of '69. Shortly right after, you'll see a big boom there. So this is a really cool website, and I encourage you to check it out if you have the time. All right, I think I'm next one, Tony. That's the actual link there on the top, and then I'm not sure. Might be just a slideshow there. We can hit the next one there, Tony. That's fine. All right, I think that's you.
That's me. Okay, so one of the things that fascinates me, is this is just because I was a practicing journalist for a long time, and then as an instructor, we ethically work so hard on having people realize to maintain impartiality. And so you look at the underground press, and it did absolutely the opposite, right? It was, oftentimes just representing one point of view. But it was an alternative point of view. So what happened is, it was a different view of society, as Roger had in that earlier slides we were talking about. There was very limited. It isn't the way media is today. There were 3 big networks. There were 2 wire services, AP and UPI, and they generally covered things the same way, and the same, issues would come up. They would not ever use provocative language, name calling. It was, it was always the goal, and we work on the goal to inform people, right, to give them information and to try to be unbiased. But these publications were the opposite. They were trying to provoke people and call, people out to be activists. The Fifth Estate, which is published in Detroit since 1965, and I grew up there, so this is the one I'm fond of to think of, and it still is being published. I think it's a little bit different, but certainly in these, times we see a resurgence of, some activism. So it's still active. Some of them are. So this story was the coverage of when Stokely Carmichael visited the city, and it covers the rally. And what it does is, and you can see this idea of using, Black power as, the term that people were, being drawn to. And it just, you think if you looked at the, regular newspapers in Detroit, they wouldn't have covered it like this. I know you can't read this, but if you look into them, it's really, talking about the positives and the, bringing so many people and things like that, that you wouldn't get in a regular coverage in a newspaper, which almost would make it seem like threatening, right? So that's, that's just a different way. And then I know Roger had some really good Black Panther covers too, but they published from 68 to 72, and their stories, were oftentimes really revolutionary, and they did try to fight institutional racism, right? So some of the headlines, in an issue that I found a lot of stuff in were about this, these four kind of brothers who went into a courthouse where there was a hearing, and they end up taking hostages, and 3 of them were killed, and the judge was killed. And it was, like I said, it's the kind of thing that you would read about it in this positive almost light in the Black Panther publication, because it was a movement to, to promote the revolution. So once again, they call it revolutionary suicide. Oh, also in that issue, there were some stories about the Cook County Hospital as a butcher shop, right? And an author, it's a first person account, an author describing the dry stench of humans rotting in deprivation. And I thought that kind of language, that inflamed language, would never have appeared, say, in most stories in the, mainstream press. One of the feminist journals that I found that looked at a lot, Leviathan, focused on the problems of operating in this terminology, things like this, a male supremacist racist system, right? So these papers, their language, the words they chose, all of that, there's never leaning towards, being open about these things or being, really impartial. It's like, this is what we see. Nobody else is writing about this or talking about it. Other issues that, came up, of course, there's, the Indigenous Peoples. They had their own publication, but I found, an article in the, in one of the Fifth Estates that it's a U.S. government report that showed the Oglala Sioux Indians had alcoholism rates 5 times the national average, and they die of cirrhosis of the liver 3.2 more times. It's the statistics, and it was a Huey report from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, said they had substandard housing, malnutrition, enforced idleness, and low educational attainment. And I would say that once again, you wouldn't, maybe that report might have been mentioned in a mainstream newspaper, but it probably would not have been handled the same way. And I think that opened it up, right? So even now we would see more, and we lean toward more investigative journalism, things like that. And I do believe even if you look at these newspapers and say the journalistic ethically they were walking a fine line, you would see that they did push the boundaries, and they did kind of force some mainstream journalists to take a closer look. And another area, the Berkeley Bar published an update on ACLU called for trying to change the laws, right, for removing criminal sanctions for private sexual acts. And I have a quote that was in that story that said, "The right of privacy should extend to all private sexual conduct and should not be a matter for involving penal statutes." So once again, that is a strong support for LGBT rights, because they were telling people that, those private sexual acts should not be, people shouldn't be arrested or charged for it. So that was cut. So then the idea that you're calling people to action, you're promoting not just, awareness, but you're saying, do something. So for one example I found of that was on a military base publication in Bedford, Massachusetts, gave instructions for filing political oppression and harassment complaints for soldiers. The RAG in Austin, Texas, called for action to block a criminal reform bill that they said was repressive. The movement of a publication of SNCC, which if you study the civil rights movement, you would know that that's the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, and they had, once again, that they did a lot of work in the South, and they worked with Martin Luther King and things like that. So that group basically had their own publication called The Movement, right? And they covered not just African American rights. They covered other issues, like when there was a Great Pickers strike in 1965 in California. Most of these papers regularly endorse protests against the Vietnam War, as the person in that video says. A lot of people think the spread of that anti-war movement really helped end the war, even though most people in government would not agree to that. Name calling, right? So we wouldn't, we would avoid this kind of thing, obviously, but generally these publications, they did not pull any punches, as you saw with the cover of the picture of Daley. They regularly referred to policemen as pigs. The government officials were devils, or Hitler, as you can see here, right? LBJ. Conservatives were called uptight. They were called exploiters of other people. And exploited people were termed like slaves. They used those words, a lot in their description of what was going on. Big business was attacked, as in the C cover in the next slide, right? So we have the Shell, Standard Oil, and Texaco. So these big oil companies, the satire here of, making them like the three pigs and profiting, so that was an interesting illustration of that kind of work.
Yeah, and the larger picture, just sorry to cut you off, but the larger picture of that seed, you can see the cranes all the way in the back, and it's like this. It's a real surreal kind of just ironic juxtaposition of them being so happy with seemingly destruction in the back. Anyways.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, them dancing and right. So, all right. So in the feminist publications, there were obviously separate feminists, but I found a really interesting story about there actually women who worked at these papers oftentimes were kind of pushed to the side, right? They were, given roles such as, doing the menial tasks of actual printing, or, delivering, or looking for ads and things like that. And sometimes some of these publications very easily kind of pushed women out of any kind of leadership roles as writers or editors. And so at one point, this paper called The Rat in New York did a publication that featured sort of pornography, and, in a way that the women who worked there just they had enough. And so they took over the publication, and they actually, started being the main editors and running it, and ran it for years after that. This one, the Feminist Voice, is from Chicago. And once again, you can just see even the headlines. This one is about working women, but an ERA and the 20-hour work week. But these feminist publications just generally had to focus on things like, working childcare, reproductive rights. And this one is interesting because in one of their issues, they had this whole column called The Lavender Woman, and it was for kind of to have a voice for the lesbian community. And it was so successful, even after the first one, the response was so strong that they made a separate publication, and they started it. And it was, once again, it was just as successful as the other. So here's the first issue of the separate publication, and other publications started to, I mean, not just from this, but were springing up across the country. So we see those rights coming into focus. And one in Los Angeles, it was called One. There was in New York one called Come Out, Amazon Quarterly in Oakland, and the Furies in Washington, D.C. But as Roger showed that chart, it's really like you can look and to see some specific issues. You could even select, say, if you wanted to see where were these kind of publications. You can even, you know, get rid of like the other issues, the civil rights issues and things like that. And so it is really interesting just to see how many where, and you know, which ones kind of sprung up in that time period. So so advertising, yes, we talk about it because of course this became the revenue, the only, you know, kind of path for revenue for these publications. And the advertisements themselves, of course, reflected the issues they were covering, the issues of the day. You can see here that, you know, there's one about being pregnant, a women's advisory center for abortion, birth control information in Livonia, Michigan. Shout out to Cynthia Wolf there. And I'm sorry. And then there's, you know, other issues for, you know, they tended to just cover things like, you know, entertainment and issues like this. So you could see the reflection of it, of what the whole newspaper had in it. Personal ads were that, and I know there are some, so I think Roger and I found a couple we just thought were kind of funny. They sometimes were, you know, very suggestive, and some of them even, you know, probably wouldn't run in any mainstream paper, but we just liked these. Like this one was, in this ad said, "Chipper, did you meditate under your pyramid today? The guru." And then this Mr. and Mrs. Hoople still dig entire sourdough scene and await groovy autumn woofing. So I don't know what that was about, but we just liked those. So it was a way, and they did, that's how they made money mostly. And I mean, that's certainly true of you know, mainstream journalism too, right? That advertising paid for the publication many times. That's what you had to do. Okay, I think the effects, and I'll let Roger take over too, the effects was it did create a community. So you felt like your community is not being represented in your concerns, you know, what you care about, what you need to know about is not being, you know, represented at all in mainstream media. So you did that. I mentioned opening up the culture. We have to credit some of these publications with not just the political movements, but also the opening, the pressure on mainstream media to cover some things that they weren't even covering, you know, they were ignoring. And so I think that really helps. And I think it just opened up people's minds. If you were in college and, you know, getting these papers, a lot of times they circulated around colleges, and it you know, it brought you news that you wouldn't get elsewhere. So so Roger, did you want to join in some of this, or?
Sorry, yeah, I had issues with the mute button there. Yeah, so in terms of creating communities, one of the things that Tony and I talked about was that this was kind of like, functionally, it sort of served as a social media before social media. So if you think about it that way, it gave you representation at a sort of larger state that you would otherwise. So just like Tony said, it was like, being able to see yourself in the news, or also get information so that you may vote more in line with what you might want to, or more in line with your interests, if you will. So the effects was really interesting. And that's the reason why I like that map so much, is because you can really see, and in some ways you can even, like if a state tends to be one way or the other politically, you might be able to make an argument, might go back and be like, okay, well, these values were instilled here in the 60s and 70s, during this generation, that might influence, you know, either current day or how those states voted. But in general, it did bring pressure on, you know, traditional media. Like I was saying with the Chicago Seed, like after that, you know, Chicago in general politics sort of shifted because of it. It was a very big deal, and being covered by other non-traditional mainstream media did apply pressure to do so by the mainstream. So is there anything you want to hit next on there?
Yeah.
Okay, those are so one of the things I did want to say was in that vein was when Tony was talking about like the Native Americans and alcohol use and things like that. That is those sorts of topics in general is when if you're in that community that's heavily affecting you, right? I mean, if it's such a large number of your members, that is something that you would want to see, right? That would, if you're a member of that community, that is kind of a public health, situation that you would want someone to step in. But if you didn't have the means or avenues to get that out, this is where this comes into play because you're publishing yourself, you're giving that value to the story, and you're bringing it to an audience that may otherwise not know. So it was a really kind of cool way for communities to talk about themselves and in their own rhetoric. And in general, so if you want to look at archives, can you click on that first link up there really quick?
Yeah, let's see if it'll go there.
Fingers crossed.
Wait, this one or the University of Washington?
Yeah, that one. No, the JSTOR one.
Okay.
Let's see if that opens up. Okay, cool. So this is a database that we have access to here through the college. And this particular page called the Independent Voices is the collection in general. So if you scroll down a little bit, you should be able to get, or is that the entire page?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. So they separated by some of the topics that we had here on the screen. So we have Black American there on the top left. We have LGBTQ here on the bottom of that. And so there's different ways to access information. Do you want to just click on one of those just so I can show them what whichever one. It's all good.
Wait, I guess we can do that. Kind of see.
So once you scroll down, you'll see that there's the covers, and then you can click on any of those, and each one of those is a different publication, and they should have the entire run. At the very least, they'll have the cover, and if they don't have the entire issue per se, like either digitized or scanned, it should tell you where you can get it. If you're interested in any of these, or you're not, if you want more information on this, send me an email or Tony, and I can get you some links and things like that. But generally speaking, this is what an archive should more or less look like. So it should have the covers, it should have the digitized actual images. You won't get transcripts. So if you're looking to like copy and paste, something from the actual text, that won't really work here. But you'll be able to see it at the very least, and you will be able to cite it if you will use it for a project. So that's all I think that we had. It's 12:45. Does anyone have any questions or comments from the audience?
One thing I forgot, Roger, that book that's on that last slide also is a very interesting book. And there was one quote from it that I really wanted to share that he said, so this guy, John McMillan, who wrote Smoking Typewriters, the 60s Underground Press, he said, these papers educated and politicized young people, helped to shore up activist communities, and were the movement's primary means of internal communication. So once again, just like a different approach to what a newspaper should be or could be. So, okay, I'll stop share then. Is that good, Roger?
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted.
Okay.
Yes, if anyone has any questions, now is your time, or any comments or anything that you might have found cool or interesting, you can feel free to share. I'm gonna sip some coffee to give people some chance here to think about it. All right. Seems like we did a good job, Tony. We explained everything thoroughly. Is that a question in the chat, or was that there before? Oh, that was just Cynthia saying yay. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I guess we can sign off. Thanks for everyone.